We all end up in the dirt. As Zoe knelt on the floor of her bedroom, carefully organizing camping supplies into her worn, olive green backpack, her father's last words to her rattled in her ears. She tucked in packets of dehydrated meals, trail mix, and jerky, along with a metal canteen filled with water. A sleeping bag and light white tent came next, followed by a compass, flashlight, pocket knife, and first aid kit. Zoe paused, gazing at a framed photo on her nightstand of herself as a young girl, beaming, next to her father on a backpacking trip. She traced her finger over his face, a bittersweet pang in her chest. "I miss you, Dad," she whispered. Taking a deep breath, Zoe zipped up the stuffed pack and hoisted it onto her shoulders, staggering a bit under the weight before regaining her balance. She felt a flutter of excitement in her stomach. This trip was just what she needed to clear her head after her father's passing. Zoe arrived at the trailhead parking lot as the morning sun peeked through the trees. Popping the trunk, she lugged out her gear, the straps of her heavy pack digging into her shoulders. Unfolding her trail map, she traced the route to her remote campsite, nestled deep in the forest. "Here we go," she murmured, taking one last deep breath of crisp morning air before venturing into the woods. The faint chirping of birds and rustling of leaves accompanied her footsteps as she hiked further from civilization, finally alone with just her thoughts and the towering pines. Zoe trekked deeper into the forest, the morning sun filtering through the canopy in hazy beams. The path grew narrower, tracing a meandering route around mossy boulders and fallen logs. She paused occasionally to consult her compass, confirming she was still on course. The terrain gradually became more rugged as she hiked, the trail rising and falling over rocky outcrops. Zoe's lungs burned as she climbed each incline, the weight of her pack exacerbating the effort. Sweat beaded on her brow despite the chill air. This was the most strenuous hike she had attempted alone. After several hours, Zoe decided to take a break. Her legs ached and her stomach rumbled with hunger. Finding a flat rock overlooking a gurgling stream, she slid her pack off with a groan of relief. The surrounding trees creaked and swayed in the breeze, leaves rustling. It was so quiet out here. Peaceful. Zoe sipped some water and nibbled on a protein bar, studying her map. She still had many miles to go before reaching her planned campsite. Folding up the map, she leaned back on her hands, taking in the primal beauty around her. She pictured her younger self on a similar trip with her dad, listening intently as he pointed out wildlife tracks and edible plants. A faint, bittersweet smile crossed her lips. After a few more minutes of rest, Zoe reshouldered her pack with a grunt and continued onward, re-energized. She paused to splash some cold water on her face from the stream, the shock waking her up. It was time to cover more ground before sunset. Zoe pressed on, the path becoming rockier and more treacherous. She had to watch her footing, stepping carefully over loose rocks and gnarled roots. The incline steepened as she hiked higher into the mountains. Her legs burned with exertion, but she maintained a brisk pace, not wanting to lose daylight. The shadows lengthened around her as the sun sank lower in the sky. Zoe glanced at her watch, quickening her stride. She had hoped to reach the campsite well before nightfall. Creatures began to stir in the underbrush as dusk approached, the faint rustling of small animals and screech of birds. Zoe felt eyes upon her as she hiked through the deepening gloom. Strange sounds echoed through the trees, setting her nerves on edge. Just a little further, she told herself, swallowing hard. Her breath came in short puffs, partly from exertion but also from growing fear. She just had to keep moving. With night falling, she was vulnerable out here alone. She pictured her cozy tent, just a few more miles away. Gripping her walking stick tighter, Zoe hurried onward, the shadows seeming to follow her every step. Her pulse quickened as the forest grew darker around her. Strange shadows played among the trees, cast by the fading light. She thought she saw movement from the corner of her eye, but when she turned, there was nothing. Just her mind playing tricks as nerves set in. The path forked unexpectedly ahead. Zoe paused, consulting her map. She had planned to take the left fork, but something drew her gaze to the right. That path looked darker, swallowed up by thick trees and underbrush. Zoe felt an inexplicable pull in that direction. Making a snap decision, she took the right fork. Her inner compass told her this was the way, though logic dictated otherwise. She moved slower now, one hand trailing along the canyon wall beside the narrow path. Zoe's breath caught in her throat as she stepped into a gloomy clearing. Hulking boulders surrounded a small open area, blanketed in shadow. Her eyes were drawn upward. There, high in the trees, was an enormous nest. It looked like it was woven from branches, leaves, even bones. Zoe stared, transfixed by the imposing structure. She had never seen anything like it. Instinctively, she knew she should turn back. But curiosity rooted her to the spot. What sort of creature could have built this? It must be massive. Images of mythical beasts flashed through her mind. Manticores, griffins, dragons of lore. All the fun stuff she used to imagine was out in the woods when she was a child. Zoe felt uneasy being so exposed beneath it. She turned slowly, surveying the silent clearing. The shadows seemed to creep towards her. Strange sounds echoed around her, faint screeches and scuttling coming from the nest above. Swallowing hard, Zoe crept towards one of the large boulders nearest the nest. She crouched down, obscured in its shadow, but still with a view of the nest. Zoe's palms were slick with sweat as she fumbled for her camera. She had to get a photo of this, some proof it existed. Peering through the lens, she zoomed in on the nest. It was a grotesque structure, made of interwoven sticks, sinew, and things she didn't want to identify. The movements inside grew more frantic, accompanied by inhuman cries. Zoe's hands trembled. She knew she should flee this place, alert a park ranger. But the scientist in her was fascinated, needing to understand the otherworldly construction. Zoe felt torn, curiosity battling fear. What was this nest? And what lived inside it? Zoe steadied her breathing and crept out from behind the boulder. She skirted the edge of the clearing, camera poised to capture any movement from the nest. The cries grew louder, more frenzied. Zoe's heart pounded against her ribs. As she neared the base of the nest, a vile stench hit her nostrils. It was the smell of decay, of something unnatural. Zoe gagged, eyes watering. She hesitated, wondering if she should turn back. But she had come too far. She had to know. She just wished her dad was with her to see it. Swallowing the bile rising in her throat, Zoe steeled herself and peered directly into the nest. What she saw made her stumble backwards with a scream. The nest was filled with revolting creatures, horrific hybrids of insects and animals fused together, mutated beyond reason. They writhed and screeched, bulging eyes swiveling in Zoe's direction. Revulsion gripped Zoe as she took in their misshapen forms, torsos of dogs with the lower bodies of centipedes, squirrels with spider legs jutting from their spine, rats with pincers snapping. It was like evolution gone horribly fucking wrong. Zoe scrambled back from the nest, heart racing. She knew she should flee this unholy place, but the scientist and Zoe hungered to understand these abominations. What happened to them? Against all reason, Zoe found herself drawn back towards the nest and its grotesque inhabitants. She had to get closer, had to observe and document them. With a shaking hand, Zoe slowly reached out towards the nearest creature, a squirrel with glistening insectoid wings. She hesitated just before contact, pulse racing. Then, she steeled herself and brushed her fingertips lightly over its fur and strange protuberances. The creature twitched under her touch but made no move against her. Its multifaceted eyes seemed to bore into Zoe's very soul. She quickly withdrew her hand, heart hammering against her ribs. Zoe reached out again, letting her fingers linger on the creature's malformed body. Its skin was clammy and oddly textured, like a reptile's. She traced the contours of its misshapen limbs, its thorax bulging with unnatural organs. "What are you?" she whispered. The creature merely twitched and gurgled in response. There were mammals fused with arachnids, birds with snake-like tails, reptiles covered in quivering tendrils. Each seemed an impossible perversion of nature. Zoe's fingertips brushed the pulsing, veiny mass. An ear-splitting screech pierced the silence of the forest. Zoe recoiled as the creatures swiveled their slitted eyes toward her, mouths agape with rows of needle-thin teeth. "Oh no," she breathed, stumbling backward. She shouldn't have touched it. Stupid fucking curiosity. The creatures skittered down the tree in a frenzy, their movements erratic and lightning quick. Zoe's heart hammered against her ribs as more creatures emerged from the underbrush, encircling her. She was trapped. Zoe turned in a circle, scanning desperately for an escape route. The creatures closed in, their claws scraping the dirt. One leapt at her face and she batted it away with a shriek. "Get back!" she yelled, waving her arms. They paid her no mind, continuing their relentless approach. She had to get out of here. Now! Zoe charged toward a gap in the creatures' formation, shoving them aside. They clung to her clothes and hair, slowing her progress. She broke free and sprinted for the cliff's edge, visible through the trees. "Don't look back," she told herself, pumping her arms. Almost there. The creatures' screeches echoed behind her. She burst from the tree line and skidded to a halt at the cliff's precipice. No time to think. She jumped. The icy water slammed into her as she plunged into the river below. Her lungs burned as she kicked toward the surface, breaking through with a gasp. Treading water, she gazed up at the cliff, crawling with creatures, and let out a shaky laugh. She'd made it. Barely. "You're in so much trouble, young lady," she imagined her father scolding. But she was alive. For now, that was enough. Zoe paddled toward the shore, her soaked clothes weighing her down. She crawled onto the muddy bank, collapsing onto her back and staring up at the darkening sky as she caught her breath. That was too close. The screeching from the cliff faded, but Zoe's heart continued to pound. She sat up and wrung the water from her hair, scanning the trees warily. Were there more of those creatures out here? She couldn't stay to find out. Zoe's feet sank into the muddy shore as she gasped for breath, chest heaving. In her panicked flight from the writhing mass in the hollow tree, she'd left her pack behind, food, water, knife, all gone. But at least she still had her life. A wet, rubbery feeling coiled around Zoe's calf. She jerked her head down with a choked cry. One of the pale, eyeless creatures from the nest was wrapped around her leg, sinuous body undulating. Revulsion clenched her gut. Zoe staggered back into the murky water, clawing at the thing, but its grip only tightened. She thrashed and kicked, trying to dislodge it. The creature's slick hide refused to budge. "Get off me!" Zoe shrieked. More of the creatures plopped from the trees, splashing into the river around her. Zoe's heart hammered against her ribs. This couldn't be happening. They swarmed over her body, their toothless mouths gaping. Zoe battered at them, panic rising in her throat. But there were too many. Their wriggling bulk weighed her down. "No, no, no!" Zoe twisted and flailed, the water churning. She had to break free. With a surge of adrenaline, Zoe lunged forward, swimming for her life. Then the creatures dragged her under. Icy water flooded Zoe's nose and mouth. She fought to the surface, lungs burning, but they kept pulling her into the depths. Zoe broke the surface again, sputtering and gasping. The creatures still swarmed her, dragging her back under even as she gulped for air. "Help!" Zoe screamed, though she knew it was futile. She was alone out here. Razor-sharp teeth sank into her shoulder, and Zoe cried out, thrashing violently. She managed to dislodge that one, only for two more to take its place. The creatures were relentless, crawling over every inch of her. Zoe fought with renewed desperation, kicking and clawing. She smashed her fist into one creature's face, feeling its bones crunch. Another she seized by the neck and flung away. But the horde was never ending. Exhaustion seeped into Zoe's muscles. Her soggy clothes weighed her down. Each glimpse of sky before being pulled under was shorter than the last. Zoe knew she couldn't hold out much longer against the endless onslaught. Zoe thrashed weakly as the creatures continued to pull her. Though her lungs burned for air, all she could do was inhale more river water. Zoe's mind grew foggy from lack of oxygen. Strange shapes and colors danced before her eyes. She no longer had the strength to fight back as the creatures swarmed her limp body, their claws and teeth tearing viciously at her flesh. Zoe's body convulsed involuntarily, the last reflexes of a dying brain. She thought of her family and friends, the people she'd never see again. Zoe wished she could tell them how much she loved them one last time. She thought of her dad and how she was going to meet him sooner than she thought. With a final shudder, Zoe's struggles ceased entirely. Her lifeless body sank into the gloom, surrounded by the ravenous creatures. Zoe's eyes stared blankly into the depths as she drifted down. A thin stream of bubbles escaped her blue lips, the last air leaving her lungs. Her outstretched arms swayed gently, beckoning the river bottom that would become her grave. Zoe's corpse settled on the murky riverbed, disturbed sediment billowing up in clouds. The creatures swarmed her immediately, their claws and teeth tearing ravenously at her flesh. They ripped into her abdomen first, her entrails spilling out in a gruesome tangle. The creatures fought over the prize, shredding her intestines as they feasted. Blood clouded the water, sending the creatures into a feeding frenzy. They tore chunks of meat from Zoe's thighs and arms, shattering bones in their voracity. Her left leg was ripped clean off, the creatures playing a macabre game of tug-of-war with the dismembered limb. Zoe's face became an unrecognizable mess as they fed. One creature pried open her jaw, gnawing on her tongue as her glassy eyes stared ahead. Her blonde hair floated ethereally around her ravaged head. Soon, little remained of the woman named Zoe, just a scattered collection of bones and shredded sinew on the riverbed. The current washed away the last traces of blood, erasing any evidence of violence. Nature quickly reclaimed Zoe's body, indifferent to her gruesome end. Small, aquatic creatures arrived to pick at her remains. Her bones would gradually scatter and become buried in the sediment, forgotten. We all end up in the dirt,